So hello everyone, hope you're feeling okay, hope everything's well by you, staying out of trouble. I wanted to do the chapter 5. We're going to talk about categorical syllogisms, and categorical syllogisms, probably mentioned in passing, are deductive arguments with two or more premises, and there's one that occurs right at the beginning of chapter 5 that looks like this: all soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers. So I'm going to diagram this, and you're going to use what I diagrammed to do all the problems really in this chapter. So let's start with the conclusion first. There's a subject term of the conclusion, traitors, and we're going to call that the minor term. Okay, the subject term of the conclusion is by definition the minor term. The predicate term of the conclusion, the term that is that comes after the copula or the verb, is the major term. And that, in this case, that's soldiers. Okay, so the premise that contains that major term will be known as the major premise. And so you can see soldiers occurs again in this premise here. So that will be our major premise. I'm just going to put major there for now because soldiers is the subject of that, is in that premise there. The minor premise, by definition, must contain the minor term. So traitors, the minor term will be there. So this is already in what we call standard form. You want to make a note of that term, standard form. Any syllogism in which the major premise comes first, the minor premise is second, and the conclusion, which I'll abbreviate, just like the whole thing, the conclusion is last, is already in standard form. So this one is in what we call standard form because it has major premise, minor premise, and then conclusion in that order. Okay. So, in addition to the major premise and the minor premise, and the major term and the minor term, you have a term that occurs once in each premise. And that's the term patriots. And that's known as the middle term. Okay, the middle term occurs here, and then it occurs right beneath. And then you'll also see, he's going to ask for, in the first set of exercises, 5.11, he's going to ask for mood and figure. Okay? Now, from the previous chapter, categorical propositions, we know that the mood of this syllogism is A, E, E. That is, universal affirmative, all soldiers are patriots. Universal negative, no traitors are patriots. And then universal negative again, no traitors are soldiers. So the mood then is A, E, E. Okay, the figure refers to the position of the middle term. And the middle term in this case, as we said, is patriots. Why? I'll repeat it. By definition, the middle term is the term that occurs once in each premise. So when you look at the list of figures in the chapter, a few pages later, there's 4 figures. When they are both in the predicate place, that is, when the middle term occurs after the verb in the first premise and after the verb in the second premise, that's called figure 2. So combined, this is an AEE figure 2. As it turns out, if you look at the list of syllogisms that's always valid, there's 19 that are always valid, AEE figure 2, no matter what the terms were, whether you were talking about soldiers or patriots or traitors or mud, or it doesn't matter what you're talking about, it would always be valid, a valid categorical syllogism in that order. So AEE figure 2 is one of the 19 valid syllogisms. There's something like Aristotle's 256 combinations of mood and figure. Only 19 are valid all the time, so it's less than 10%. So with these, we're going to have to say whether these are valid or invalid. So we were just saying that this is the mood and figure is AEE figure 2. If you look on page 277, there's a chart, a table of unconditionally valid forms, and it says AEE figure 2 is always valid. So the first exercise is really just asking you to do a little accounting. This is on exercise 5.1, page 279. It says the following syllogisms are in the standard form. Identify the major, minor, and middle terms, as well as the mood and figure of each. Then use the 2 lists of valid syllogistic forms to determine whether each is valid from Boolean and Aristotelian standpoint or invalid. I'm not worried about Aristotelian and Boolean standpoint, nor was I worried about it in chapter 4. But you can just do a little accounting by going back to the previous page, 277, and looking at the first one. First start with the 5.1 on 279. All neutron stars are things that produce intense gravity. All neutron stars are extremely dense objects. Therefore, all extremely dense objects are things that produce intense gravity. If you were to check that out from the standpoint of mood and figure, you want to say whether that's valid or invalid. So, I noticed that the mood of that universal affirmative is A, second premise is A, conclusion is A, so AAA is the mood. The figure refers to, again, the position of the middle term, and the middle term, it says neutron stars. All neutron stars are things that produce intense gravity. All neutron stars are extremely dense objects. Neutron stars is in the subject place in both. That's figure 3. You can match those moods and figures up with what you see on page 276. So if you look at figure 3 on page 276, when the M or middle term is in the subject place in the first premise and the subject place in the second premise, then you have figure 3. So it's AAA figure 3, and then you can line that up with what you see on the valid forms on 277. It says unconditionally valid forms under figure 3 are IAI, AII, OAO, and EIO, but you don't see AA figure 3, so this one is invalid. And that's how you do those. And so you'll see from the syllabus that I created which ones I'm asking you to do, but you're really just asking here, you're looking at a chart to see which are valid or invalid. Later, we'll test them with a Venn diagram. Okay, so that's how you do I'll do one more of those in where the mood and figure is already, where you have to discover what the mood and figure is. So let's take number 4, 5.1, same exercise there on 279. It says, no people who mix facts with fantasy are good witnesses. Some hypnotized people are people who mix fact with fantasy. Therefore, some hypnotized people are not good witnesses. All right, so first try to get the mood of that. And then the mood looks like no people mix fact with, that's universal negative, so that's an E proposition. Some people who hypnotize people mix fact with fantasy, that's some are, that's an I proposition. Some hypnotized people are not good witnesses, that's an O proposition. So it's EIO, and what position is the middle term in? People who mix fact with fantasy, and people who mix fact with fantasy first in the subject place, in the first premise, then in the predicate place. So that's EIO figure 1, and you would check that out against the chart on 277 again, and you see that EIO figure 1 is a valid syllogism. So that's how you do that. Later you're going to have to prove it. You won't be able to look at a chart. I'm not going to give you a chart to say whether something is valid or invalid. But okay, so we're going to go to 5.1 Roman numeral 2. These are syllogisms that are not in standard form, but you're being asked to put them in standard form. Okay, so if you look at page 280, which is 5.1 Roman numeral 2, it says put them into standard form using letters to represent the terms, the name, and name the mood and figure, then the two lists of valid syllogisms form, determine whether each is valid. Okay, so the lists are used again. So in this case, you're going to have to go back to something from the first chapter, which are premise and conclusion indicators. So I can see by the so, read it through once, no Republicans are Democrats, so no Republicans are big spenders, since all big spenders are Democrats. I can see that so is the conclusion indicators, so I want to write that, what comes after so, as the conclusion. So no Republicans are big spenders is the conclusion there. Well, that's all I need to really do the rest of the problem, isn't it? Because the subject term, or the minor term, will be the subject of that conclusion. The predicate term, or the major term, will be will come after the verb, and then I just find out where those terms occur again. Big spenders is the major term, so that will occur again in the major premise. All big spenders are Democrats, will be that major premise. Just abbreviate Democrats. And then the remaining premise will be the minor premise. No Republicans are Democrats. Okay, so mood and figure, AEE. AE is the mood. The figure, that has to do with the predicate term, or the middle term, sorry, and where it occurs. It occurs after the verb in premise 1, occurs after the verb in premise 2, the minor premise that is. When both are flush right, so to speak, or both in the predicate place like that, that happens to be figure 2, AEE2. And AEE2, if you check that against the lists that are provided on 277, that happens to be invalid. You won't always have a list to do these with. You'll have to do it with Venn diagrams, and so it'll test your knowledge of a Venn diagram to say whether something is valid or invalid. Let's do one more of those from 5.1 figure 2, just so you get the knack of it. These are not in standard form. The challenge is to put them in standard form, which is to say major premise first, minor premise second, conclusion last. Let's take number 10. Okay, we're back to 5.1 Roman numeral 2, and we're going to try number 7 there with the star next to it. It says all pranksters are exasperating individuals. Consequently, some leprechauns are exasperating individuals since all leprechauns are pranksters. Okay, what's the conclusion indicator there? We know consequently precedes the conclusion. So some leprechauns are exasperating individuals must be the conclusion. I'm going to abbreviate. Some leprechauns are exasperating individuals. That's the conclusion of that. And now I can look at that to say, where does the minor term? The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. That happens to be leprechauns. Exasperating individuals is the major term. That's the predicate of the conclusion. And where do those terms occur again? That's the key in putting it into standard form. Well, I'm going to look for exasperating individuals. Exasperating individuals occurs in the first statement. All pranksters are exasperating individuals. Okay, now that has you'll notice that has the major term. That's how I knew it was the major premise. The remaining premise, therefore, must be the minor premise. All leprechauns are pranksters. Okay. If I look at the mood and figure of that, I have universal affirmative, particular affirmative. That's I. Right horizontally this time, and then the figure refers to the position of the middle term. Middle term is the term that occurs once in each premise. So in this case, AII figure 1. And again, you're going to check that against the list of the table provided on 277. AII figure 1 happens to be valid. It'll always be valid, doesn't matter the terms used, pranksters, individuals, leprechauns, that has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the form of the argument, as Aristotle said. That's what makes something valid or invalid. All right, so we're going to go to 5.1, figure 3, where you're just given a mood and a figure, and you have to build the form of a syllogism from that. Actually, mood plus figure equals form. And so if you have the mood plus the figure of a syllogism, that equals the form. And so you're given, in these cases, 5.1 Roman numeral 3, you're given several forms of arguments. Take number 1. You're given OAE3. I should have written that vertically, so I'll do it again. OAE3. Okay, so what is an E proposition? 3 would be no S, subject, equal is predicate is P. And so the P term has to go in figure 3. We know that according to the figures provided on page 276, figure 3, the M term, or the middle term, must occur both times in the subject place. So that would be some M is not P. I know that P was there because that had to be the major premise. I want to put the major premise first, and then I get, if it's standard form, and if it's all M is S, I know that S is there because it's the minor premise. So you have major premise first, minor premise second, and conclusion last. Okay, so that's the way that looks. And what are you being asked to do with that? All you're being asked to do is reconstruct it from the mood in the figure. So I'm going to do one more with you, so you get the knack of it. Hope it's going well so far. And so I think the reading that's assigned in the syllabus is not terribly exciting, but if you do that, these terms will become familiar to you. So number 4 gives you I, A, E, figure 1. Okay? Well, IA, do the conclusion first, that's the order of operation. So if it's an E, we know that's universal negative, so no S is P. In figure 1, the middle term occurs first in the subject place and second in the predicate place. And then I'm told it's I is particular affirmative, that's some M or P. And then we have A, we know that A is universal affirmative, so that's all S is M. And that's the way that would look, i.e. figure 1. You're not being asked to say whether it's valid or invalid for the practice. You might want to look back at those tables to see whether that's valid or invalid. But that's so far what we've done, okay? So that completes exercise 5.1. Next, in 5.2, we won't be looking at a table to test these arguments. We're going to be testing them with a Venn diagram. There's no real logical skill in looking at a table. That's just accounting to do that. And you want to do the problem yourself and say whether it's valid or invalid. That's the subject of 5.2 Venn diagrams. Okay? Hope that was understandable to you. If you see my dog Plato run into the shot, he's a ham, so he wants to become part of this demonstration. So we're at 5.2, Roman numeral 1, and I want to look at some of the arguments that Plato's calling. He doesn't like this logic stuff. So we're looking, folks, at 5.2, Roman numeral 1 here, and you'll see it says all high-fat diets are diets high in cholesterol. Some diets high in cholesterol are not healthy food programs. Therefore, some healthy food programs are not high-fat diets. Well, it helps to start with the conclusion. You'll know what the subject term and predicate term is if you do that. So some S or not P is that conclusion. It's a O proposition. You'll notice from the last chapter, particular negative that is. The S term is the subject of the conclusion. The P term is the predicate of the conclusion, and it says not P. That's how I know it's an O proposition. I can tell from that high-fat diets then is the major term. And that occurs again in the subject place of the first premise. Look, all high-fat diets are diets high in cholesterol. So if I was to rewrite that, I'd have all P as M. Diets high in cholesterol is the M term. I know that because that M term occurs again in the next premise. Some diets high in cholesterol are not healthy food programs. So M, diets high in cholesterol are not healthy food programs. I know that's the S term, healthy food programs, because that occurred in the subject of the conclusion. So you have this, all P is M, some M are not S, and some S are not P. You're not done yet. You then have to take that and put that into a Venn diagram, all right? So here's what you have to do. And I'm going to have to go lower for this to do the Venn diagram. Okay? In the Venn diagram, M, S, and P circles must be drawn. M for the middle term, S for the subject, P for the predicate. Okay, so I'm doing this. I'm going to start with any universal premises first. Well, not a problem here. All P is M says that every P there is inside of M. Well, where do those regions overlap? You can number these regions. I will just to refer to them. You don't have to do that later. But when I say all P is M, that is every P that there is contained in the M circle. So there is no P outside of M. So all the P's that would be outside of M I'm going to shade. That is 6 and 7. All P is M. All right, so all the P's are really in there then. You don't have to write that P, but it might be a reminder for you. Then you have some M are not S. Some means at least one, you'll remember, and that M has to be outside of S. There's at least one M that's not an S. But that M that's not an S could be a P. So we're going to put it on the border of P over here to indicate that it might still be a P. It has to be in M, outside of S, as it clearly is, and on the border of P. You'll see that we can't put it in region 1, because that would be an M that's outside of an S that's definitely not a P. We can't assume that. We'll put it on the border of P. Now, after you've drawn the two premises, you then have to take stock of the conclusion and say, does the diagram say what that conclusion says? The conclusion says some S are not P, which says to me there's at least one S that's not a P. Does that diagram say that there's at least one S that's not a P? The only way it could say that, if there was an S here, if we knew there was something in that S circle that was not in V circle. We don't know that. We haven't been given that up above. You can only get in the conclusion what you've been given in the premises. So this has to be invalid. And so AOO, in this case, figure 4, is an invalid argument, okay? And indeed, if you were to just check that against the table of the arguments, you would see that it was invalid. So, but it's AO4 has to be invalid, some S are not P. Let's take another one of those. 5.2, Roman numeral 2, everyone. And it says here, at the bottom of page 294, use Venn diagrams to obtain the conclusion that is validly implied by each of the following sets of premises. If no conclusion can be validly drawn, write no conclusion. So let's take number 1 with the star next to it. No P or M, all S or M, and is something implied or not? Well, you might be able to do it in your head, but that's unlikely. You'll probably have to use a Venn diagram to figure it out. And then you'll need, again, 3 circles to do this. S, P, and M. So, and there are those 7 regions that those 3 circles comprise. So no P or M says that there's nothing in the class of P that's also an M. So where do P and M overlap? At 3 and 4. That football-shaped region right there. And 3 and 4, you just draw that in to indicate there's nothing there. All S are M says that all S's that there are contained in M. So you just shade that in to indicate every S that would be outside of M has to be shaded to indicate there's nothing there. Shading, contrary to what you might have learned in the past, indicates there's nothing there. All the S's that there are now then are in 2, in M. Now what conclusion can you draw from what you've seen here? What's the relationship between S and P? All right? Well, S and P overlap at 3 and 6, this region here. And those have already been shaded. So what does that say? It says that no S are P. And that's the answer to that problem. That is validly implied. That would be an E, A, E, figure 2, since the M terms are both in the predicate place. EAE, figure 2, is always a valid argument. Okay? In this case, you have 5.1, Roman numeral 2, number 4. Some M are not P. All M are S. And then you have to say whether there's a conclusion that follows from that. So I'll leave that blank. Some M are not P, all M are S. If you have a particular premise, like an O premise in this case, and then a universal premise, which in this case is an A premise, you do the universal premise first. You don't want that is because you don't want to put an X there and then, which indicates some single entity, and then cross over that by shading in, which, so you first do the universal premise, all M are S. So this says to me, every M outside of S is non-existent. If all the M's are in S, they're in this region here, 2 and 3. And every M outside of there doesn't exist. All M happens to be in S. Then I would do the particular premise next. Some M are not P. Okay? So if some M are not P, that has to be in the region 2, because there's no place else for it to go. You've already shaded 1 and 4, and the M has to be outside of P. So the M that's outside of P is also in S. So what can we say? We can say that anything that's in that region 2 is also outside of P, so some S is not P. So in this case, O, A, O, figure 3 happens to be a valid argument. You showed it with a Venn diagram. As to say there's at least one S that's not a P. Okay, so that's number 4.